The morning mist hung heavy over London as millions gathered to witness history. Queen Elizabeth II's funeral would be the most watched event in decades, with world leaders, dignitaries, and common citizens united in grief. Among the sea of black uniforms and solemn faces stood Sergeant James Mitchell, a decorated member of the Queen's Guard with 15 years of impeccable service. James had always been different from his fellow guards. While others saw their duty as ceremonial tradition, he felt a personal connection to the royal family that ran deeper than protocol. His grandfather had served the Queen Mother, and his father had protected Princess Diana during her most vulnerable moments. The Mitchell family had dedicated 3 generations to the crown, carrying forward a legacy of unwavering loyalty and sacrifice. Standing at attention in his pristine red tunic and bearskin hat, James appeared to be the picture of military precision. His polished boots reflected the gray London sky, and his rifle remained perfectly positioned as thousands of mourners filed past Westminster Abbey. To observers, he was just another faceless guardian maintaining the dignity of this historic moment. They had no idea of the turmoil brewing beneath his stoic exterior. The weight of his personal connection to the Queen pressed heavily on his shoulders. 3 months earlier, during a private garden party at Buckingham Palace, Her Majesty had personally thanked him for his years of service. She had mentioned his family's dedication and asked about his young daughter Emma, who was battling leukemia. The Queen had even sent a handwritten note to Emma, encouraging her to stay strong and promising to remember her in her prayers. That conversation had transformed James from a dutiful soldier into something more personal. The Queen had seen him not as just another guard, but as a human being with real struggles and pain. In that moment, she had shown him the same compassion she had displayed to countless subjects throughout her 70-year reign. For James, protecting her had become more than a job. It had become a sacred trust between 2 people who understood loss and responsibility. As the funeral procession began to move, James noticed something that made his blood run cold. In the crowd, roughly 50 meters from his position, a man in a dark coat was behaving strangely. While everyone else stood respectfully with their heads bowed or eyes fixed on the coffin, this individual was scanning the area methodically, his hand moving repeatedly to something concealed beneath his jacket. The man's movements were subtle but unmistakable to someone with James's training. He had seen this behavior before during security briefings and counterterrorism exercises. The way the stranger positioned himself behind a group of elderly mourners, using them as cover while maintaining clear sight lines to the funeral route, sent every alarm bell ringing in James's experienced mind. Protocol dictated that James should alert his superior through the discreet communication system built into his uniform. He should maintain his position and let the plainclothes security officers handle any potential threats. The Queen's Guard were ceremonial protectors, symbols of tradition rather than active security personnel. Their role was to stand silent and motionless, representing centuries of unwavering service to the crown. But as James watched the suspicious figure edge closer to the procession route, time seemed to slow down. The man's hand was now clearly gripping something metallic beneath his coat. His eyes had locked onto the approaching hearse carrying the Queen's coffin, and his body language had shifted from nervous surveillance to focused determination. James's mind raced through his options. Following protocol meant potentially allowing a tragedy to unfold during the most sacred moment in recent British history. The security detail might not spot the threat in time, and the consequences could be catastrophic. The Queen's final journey could be marred by violence, and the nation's grief could be transformed into something far more terrible. In that split second, James made a decision that would define not only his career but his entire life. The man in the dark coat was now reaching for whatever he had concealed, his movements becoming more urgent and deliberate. The funeral procession was less than 30 seconds away from passing directly in front of the potential threat. Without breaking his rigid posture, James began to calculate angles and timing. He could see the plainclothes officers, but they were focused on other sections of the crowd. Radio communication would take too long and hand signals would be useless from his current position. The weight of 3 generations of Mitchell family service pressed down on him as he prepared to make a choice that would either save the day or end his military career forever. The crowd's murmur grew quieter as the procession approached, and James could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. In 15 years of service, he had never faced a moment like this. Everything his grandfather and father had taught him about duty, honor, and sacrifice crystallized into a single moment of terrible clarity. The man in the dark coat took another step forward, his hand now visibly moving beneath his jacket. Time was running out, and James knew that in the next few seconds he would have to choose between following orders and following his conscience. The Queen's final journey hung in the balance, and the weight of that responsibility was about to change everything. The moment of decision arrived like a thunderclap. James watched as the suspicious man's hand emerged from his coat, revealing not a weapon but a crumpled envelope. Relief should have flooded through him, but something about the man's desperate expression and erratic behavior still felt wrong. The stranger was now pushing through the crowd, not with malicious intent, but with the frantic energy of someone racing against time. James realized his mistake in that instant. This wasn't a terrorist or assassin. This was someone with an entirely different mission. The man stumbled forward, tears streaming down his weathered face as he clutched the envelope to his chest. His lips were moving in what appeared to be a desperate prayer or plea, and his entire body shook with emotion that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. Breaking protocol in the smallest way possible, James shifted his gaze to track the man's movements. What he saw next made his heart clench with understanding. The stranger was an elderly veteran, probably in his 70s, wearing medals barely visible beneath his dark coat. The envelope he carried bore the unmistakable royal seal, yellowed with age and worn from countless careful handlings. The veteran was now just meters from the funeral route, but palace security had finally noticed his unusual behavior. 2 plainclothes officers were moving to intercept him, their professional efficiency about to prevent what James suddenly realized was not a threat, but a final act of devotion. The old soldier was trying to return something to his queen, one last gesture of service that had driven him to travel what might have been hundreds of miles. James faced an impossible choice. He could maintain his position and watch as security removed the veteran, whose obvious distress suggested this might be his only chance to fulfill whatever promise he had made. Or he could break the most sacred rule of his service and abandon his post to help a fellow servant of the crown complete his mission. The funeral procession was now so close that James could see the flowers on the Queen's coffin, each petal carefully arranged as a tribute to her extraordinary life. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone present, but for James it carried additional significance. He remembered the Queen's personal words about service, about seeing the humanity in everyone who served the crown, regardless of their rank or role. In his peripheral vision, James saw the veteran stumble, his age and emotion overwhelming his determination. The envelope fluttered in his trembling hands, and for a terrifying moment, it seemed like it might fall into the crowd and be lost forever. The security officers were closing in, their duty clear, but their understanding of the situation limited by their focus on potential threats rather than acts of love. Without conscious thought, James made his choice. In one fluid movement that seemed to happen in slow motion, he stepped forward from his assigned position. The action was barely noticeable to most observers, just a single step that brought him closer to the edge of the crowd. But to anyone familiar with the Queen's Guard protocol, it was equivalent to shouting in a cathedral. His fellow guards noticed immediately. Corporal Williams, stationed 10 feet to his left, shot him a look of pure shock. Sergeant Major Davidson, monitoring the formation from his position near the Abbey steps, began moving toward James with the purposeful stride of someone about to enforce military discipline. The radio chatter in James's earpiece crackled with urgent queries about his position change, but James was committed now, and the sight of the elderly veteran's desperation drove him forward. He could see the security officers reaching for the old man, their professional concern about unauthorized contact with the funeral route, overriding any consideration of the veteran's obvious emotional state. In seconds, they would escort him away, and whatever final tribute he had carried would remain undelivered. James took another step, then another. Each movement felt like a small earthquake in the carefully choreographed ceremony. He could hear his name being spoken sharply through his earpiece, orders to return to position delivered in the clipped tones of military authority. His career was dissolving with every step, 15 years of perfect service evaporating in real time. The veterans saw him coming, and their eyes met across the small distance that separated them. In that instant, James saw something that made every risk worthwhile. The old soldier's face transformed from desperation to hope, from lonely determination to grateful recognition. Here was another guardian of the crown, someone who understood the weight of service and the importance of keeping faith with promises made to the sovereign. Without breaking stride, James reached the veteran just as the security officers arrived. The situation balanced on a knife's edge, with protocol demanding one action and compassion suggesting another. The funeral procession was now passing directly in front of them, the Queen's coffin so close that James could see his reflection in its polished surface. The lead security officer, a professional James recognized from previous ceremonies, stepped forward with his hand raised. His expression was firm but not unkind, clearly prepared to handle the situation with minimum disruption to the proceedings. But he hadn't anticipated the intervention of a Queen's Guard, and uncertainty flickered across his features as he tried to understand what was happening. James found himself standing between duty and humanity, between the rules that had governed his life and the higher calling that had driven him to serve. The veteran clutched his envelope, looking between James and the approaching officers with the desperate hope of someone whose entire mission hung in the balance. The Queen's coffin was now directly in front of them, carried by 8 guardsmen whose synchronized steps represented the ultimate expression of military precision and respect. In moments, the opportunity would be lost forever, and whatever message the veteran carried would remain undelivered. James felt the weight of history pressing down on him as he prepared to make the defining choice of his life. Time seemed frozen as James stood face to face with the elderly veteran. The old man's hands trembled as he held the yellowed envelope, and James could now see the careful handwriting on its surface. In faded ink, written in the formal script of decades past, were the words, "For Her Majesty with eternal gratitude, Private Thomas Hartwell, Royal Marines." The name meant nothing to James, but the tears streaming down the veteran's weathered cheeks spoke volumes about the contents of that envelope. This was clearly a man who had served his country and his queen with distinction, and whatever message he carried had been precious enough to bring him to this moment, despite his obvious frailty and the overwhelming security presence. The lead security officer stepped closer, his radio crackling with urgent communications from the command center. James could hear fragments of the chatter, concerns about unauthorized personnel near the procession route, questions about the guard who had broken formation, and orders to clear the area immediately. The entire security apparatus was now focused on their small group, adding pressure to an already impossible situation. James made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. Instead of returning to his position or attempting to explain the situation, he gently placed his white-gloved hand on the veteran's shoulder. The gesture was subtle but unmistakable, a sign of solidarity between 2 men who had dedicated their lives to serving the crown. "What do you need to do, sir?" James asked quietly, his voice barely audible above the solemn music of the funeral procession. The veteran's eyes widened with gratitude and relief. "I promised her," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. 40 years ago, when she visited our base after the Falklands, I promised I would return this to her personally. It's a letter from my son. He didn't make it home and she wrote to comfort his mother. I've carried it ever since, waiting for the right moment." The story hit James like a physical blow. This wasn't about protocol or ceremony. It was about a father's grief and a mother's compassion spanning 4 decades. The Queen had written to comfort a grieving family, and that letter had become a sacred trust for a man who had lost his child in service to the crown. The security officer stepped forward again, his patience clearly wearing thin. The funeral procession was creating a tight schedule that couldn't accommodate delays, and the presence of unauthorized personnel so close to the route was triggering multiple security protocols. James could see more officers converging on their position, and he knew that in seconds the situation would be resolved through standard procedures that wouldn't account for the emotional weight of the veteran's mission. Without hesitation, James made the decision that would define his legacy. He turned toward the passing procession, and in clear violation of every rule governing his conduct, he raised his right hand in a formal military salute. The gesture was directed not at the security officers or the crowd, but at the Queen's coffin as it passed mere feet away. The effect was immediate and electric. The veteran, understanding the signal, stepped forward with James beside him. Together, they approached the edge of the funeral route, where James's presence as an active Queen's Guard created a momentary corridor of respect and recognition. The veteran's hand shook as he held the envelope aloft, a final tribute to the woman who had shown kindness to his family during their darkest hour. James maintained his salute, using his position and uniform to shield the old man from the approaching security team and to honor the sacred nature of what was happening. The moment stretched into something timeless and profound. Here was the essence of the monarchy's relationship with its people. Not the pomp and ceremony, but the personal connections forged through shared service and mutual respect. The Queen's coffin passed by, carried by guards who maintained their steady pace despite the unusual scene unfolding beside the route. Several members of the public noticed what was happening. Cell phones emerged, capturing images of the uniformed guard standing beside the emotional veteran. The crowd seemed to sense that they were witnessing something extraordinary, a spontaneous act of respect that transcended normal protocol. James felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Sergeant Major Davidson beside him. Instead of the anger James expected, he saw something else in his superior's eyes, understanding tinged with professional concern. Davidson had served for 25 years and had witnessed enough human drama to recognize authenticity when he saw it. "Sergeant Mitchell," Davidson said quietly, "you realize what you've done?" "Yes, sir," James replied, still maintaining his salute. "I understand completely." Davidson looked at the veteran, who was now weeping openly as he watched the Queen's coffin disappear into the distance. The old man clutched the undelivered envelope to his chest, his mission incomplete, but his gesture witnessed by thousands. The security officers had stopped their approach, seemingly uncertain about how to handle a situation involving an active member of the Queen's Guard. "Private Hartwell," Davidson said, addressing the veteran by the name James had overheard. "I believe you have something that belongs to Her Majesty." The veteran looked up with surprise and hope, unclear about what was happening but sensing a shift in the dynamics around him. James lowered his salute but remained at attention, prepared to face whatever consequences awaited him. Davidson extended his hand toward the envelope. "As the senior non-commissioned officer present, I can ensure this reaches the proper authorities. Your service to the Crown and your son's sacrifice will not be forgotten." The gesture broke something open in the veteran's chest. 40 years of carrying this burden, of waiting for the right moment, of hoping for one final connection to the Queen who had shown such kindness to his family, culminated in this moment of recognition and respect. James watched as the envelope changed hands, understanding that he had just participated in something far more important than any ceremonial duty he had ever performed. The aftermath of James's decision unfolded like ripples in still water. As the funeral procession continued its solemn journey, word of the Guard's unprecedented break in protocol spread through the ranks with lightning speed. Radio chatter buzzed with reports and questions, while officers tried to assess whether the incident represented a security breach or something else entirely. Sergeant Major Davidson carefully tucked the veteran's envelope into his dress uniform, treating it with the reverence due to a sacred artifact. Private Hartwell stood shakily, the weight of 4 decades finally lifting from his shoulders. The relief on his face was so profound that even the security officers seemed moved by the sight of this old soldier's burden being acknowledged and accepted. James remained at attention, knowing that his career hung in the balance but feeling an unexpected sense of peace. He had chosen compassion over protocol, and while the consequences might be severe, he couldn't bring himself to regret the decision. The image of the Queen's personal kindness to his family, and her reminder that service meant seeing the humanity in others, had guided his actions. The crowd around them had grown larger, as word spread through the mourners about what they had witnessed. Cell phone videos began appearing on social media within minutes, showing the touching moment when the Queen's Guard had stepped forward to help an elderly veteran. The footage was grainy and the audio unclear, but the emotion of the scene was unmistakable. Davidson gestured for James to follow him back toward Westminster Abbey, while 2 junior officers gently escorted Private Hartwell to a quiet area where he could collect himself. The veteran moved slowly, his mission complete but his body clearly exhausted by the emotional intensity of the morning. As they walked, Davidson spoke in low tones that only James could hear. "In 30 years of service, I've never seen anything like that. You realize there will be an investigation? A formal review? Possibly a court-martial?" James nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I understand, sir. But I couldn't watch him fail in his mission. Not today. Not when it meant so much to him." Davidson stopped walking and turned to face James directly. His expression was unreadable, a mixture of professional concern and something that might have been admiration. "Tell me about the veteran. How did you know he wasn't a threat?" James explained what he had observed. The medals partially visible beneath the man's coat. The careful way he held the envelope. The desperate grief in his movements rather than malicious intent. He described the moment when their eyes met and he recognized a fellow servant of the Crown, someone whose loyalty and dedication matched his own. "You took an enormous risk," Davidson said. "If you had been wrong, if he had posed a real threat, the consequences could have been catastrophic." "Yes, sir. But I wasn't wrong. And sometimes serving the Crown means serving the people who have given everything to it." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a senior officer James didn't recognize. The man wore the insignia of palace security and carried the bearing of someone accustomed to handling sensitive situations. His approach meant that James's actions had already reached the highest levels of the security apparatus. "Sergeant Mitchell," the officer said, his tone neutral but firm. "I'm Commander Stevens, responsible for coordinating today's security arrangements. I need you to come with me for a debriefing." James straightened to full attention. This was the moment he had known would come, the formal accounting for his breach of protocol. He glanced once more toward where Private Hartwell was being cared for by junior officers, satisfied that the veteran's needs were being addressed. As they walked toward a command vehicle parked behind Westminster Abbey, Stevens surprised James by speaking in conversational tones, rather than the clipped military formality he expected. That was quite a scene out there. The veteran seemed genuinely distressed. "Yes, sir. He had been carrying a letter from the Queen for 40 years, written to comfort his family after his son died in the Falklands. He wanted to return it to her personally." Stevens nodded thoughtfully. "We've been monitoring social media since the incident. The video footage is spreading rapidly, and the public response is interesting. People are calling it a beautiful tribute to the Queen's compassion and the dedication of her guards." James felt a flicker of surprise. He had expected public criticism for his breach of protocol, not support. The idea that people might understand and approve of his actions hadn't occurred to him in the heat of the moment. "However," Stevens continued, his tone becoming more serious, "we can't ignore the fact that you left your assigned position during one of the most significant ceremonies in recent history. Protocol exists for reasons that go beyond tradition. It ensures predictability and security in situations where any deviation could have serious consequences." They reached the command vehicle, a mobile operations center equipped with multiple screens, showing feeds from security cameras positioned throughout the funeral route. James could see his own position marked on one of the monitors, with his movement away from the formation clearly tracked and recorded. Stevens gestured for James to sit at a small table inside the vehicle. The space was cramped but efficiently organized, with communication equipment and documentation materials arranged for maximum functionality. James noticed that several senior officers were monitoring their conversation, their expressions serious but not openly hostile. "I want to understand your decision-making process," Stevens said, pulling out a digital recorder. "This conversation is being documented for the official review, but I want you to speak freely about what you observed and why you acted as you did." James began recounting the events, starting with his initial observation of the veteran's unusual behavior, and continuing through his decision to break formation. As he spoke, he watched Stevens's expression for signs of judgment or disapproval, but the commander seemed genuinely interested in understanding rather than condemning. "You mentioned that you recognized something in the veteran," Stevens said when James finished his account. "Can you elaborate on that?" James paused, trying to find words for something that had been more intuitive than analytical. "He moved like a soldier, sir. Even in his distress, even at his age, he carried himself with military bearing. And the way he held that envelope, it wasn't casual or careless. It was precious to him, something he had protected and preserved for decades." Stevens made notes on a tablet as James spoke, occasionally asking clarifying questions about timing and positioning. The conversation felt more like a professional consultation than an interrogation, which gave James hope that his actions might be viewed with understanding rather than purely through the lens of disciplinary violation. The investigation into James's actions took an unexpected turn when Commander Stevens received an urgent message on his secure communication device. His expression shifted from professional inquiry to something approaching amazement as he read the text. He looked up at James with renewed interest, then stepped outside the command vehicle to make a private phone call. While Stevens was gone, James found himself alone with his thoughts for the first time since the incident. The adrenaline was beginning to fade, replaced by a growing awareness of what he had risked. 15 years of perfect service, 3 generations of family tradition, and his own future in the military had all been placed in jeopardy for a moment of human compassion. Yet as he replayed the scene in his mind, he felt no regret. The relief in Private Hartwell's eyes when Sergeant Major Davidson accepted the letter had been worth any professional consequences. Some things transcended protocol, and honoring the sacrifice of families who had given everything to the Crown was surely one of them. Stevens returned to the vehicle with an expression James couldn't quite read. Behind him walked a woman in elegant black attire, whom James didn't recognize but whose bearing suggested significant authority. Her presence immediately changed the atmosphere in the command center, with junior officers straightening and senior staff showing obvious deference. "Sergeant Mitchell," Stevens said, his voice carrying a formality that hadn't been there before, "I'd like you to meet Lady Catherine Pemberton, Private Secretary to His Majesty the King." James shot to attention, his mind racing as he tried to understand why someone from the royal household would be personally involved in what should have been a routine disciplinary matter. Lady Pemberton studied him with intelligent eyes that seemed to take in every detail of his appearance and demeanor. "Sergeant Mitchell," she said, her voice carrying the cultured tones of the British upper class, "I understand you assisted an elderly veteran during today's proceedings." "Yes, ma'am. I did what I felt was necessary to honor his service and his connection to Her late Majesty." Lady Pemberton nodded thoughtfully. "Commander Stevens has provided me with the details of the incident, and I've also reviewed the social media coverage. The public response has been quite remarkable, overwhelmingly positive, with many people praising both your compassion and the veteran's dedication." She paused, consulting a folder she carried. "I've also had the opportunity to examine the letter that Private Hartwell attempted to return today. It is indeed genuine correspondence from Her late Majesty, written in 1982 to console the family of Marine David Hartwell, who died during the Falklands conflict." James felt his breath catch. The letter was real, and its significance was even greater than he had imagined. A grieving father had carried the Queen's personal words of comfort for 40 years, treating them as a sacred trust that could only be returned to the sovereign herself. The letter, Lady Pemberton continued, contained some remarkable passages about service, sacrifice, and the bonds between the Crown and those who serve it. Her Majesty wrote about how individual acts of kindness and recognition could strengthen the fabric of the nation, and how every person who served the Crown deserved to be seen and valued as an individual. The irony wasn't lost on James. The very letter that had prompted his breach of protocol contained the Queen's own thoughts about the importance of treating people with humanity and compassion, even within the rigid structures of royal service. Stevens cleared his throat. "Ma'am, regarding the disciplinary proceedings," Lady Pemberton raised her hand gently. "That's actually why I'm here, Commander. His Majesty has been briefed on today's events, and he has expressed some very specific thoughts about how this situation should be handled." James felt his heart rate increase. The idea that his actions had reached the attention of the King himself was both terrifying and surreal. He had served the royal family for 15 years without ever speaking directly to any of them, and now his moment of compassion had apparently become a matter of royal interest. "Sergeant Mitchell," Lady Pemberton said, "His Majesty believes that your actions today embodied the very best traditions of service to the Crown. You saw a fellow servant in distress and chose compassion over rigid adherence to protocol. The King feels that this represents exactly the kind of humanity and understanding that his mother would have wanted to see in those who serve her." Memory. The relief that washed over James was so intense that he had to steady himself against the table. Not only was he not going to face court-martial, but the highest authority in the land had apparently approved of his decision. However, Lady Pemberton continued, and James felt his stomach drop again. There are still protocols and procedures that must be acknowledged. Your actions, while well-intentioned and ultimately beneficial, did represent a significant departure from established security procedures. Stephen stepped forward. What Lady Pemberton is saying, Sergeant Mitchell, is that while your motives and actions have been praised at the highest levels, we need to find a way to address the precedent this sets for future ceremonial duties. James nodded, understanding the delicate balance between recognizing his compassionate choice and maintaining the discipline essential to royal security. I accept full responsibility for my actions, ma'am. I'm prepared for whatever consequences are deemed appropriate. Lady Pemberton smiled, the first time her formal demeanor had softened since she arrived. Actually, Sergeant Mitchell, His Majesty has a rather different idea about consequences. He believes that someone with your judgment and compassion might be better suited to a role where such qualities are not just permitted, but required. James looked between Lady Pemberton and Stevens, unsure of what was being suggested. The conversation had taken so many unexpected turns that he no longer felt capable of predicting what might come next. His Majesty is offering you a position within the royal household, Lady Pemberton explained, specifically as part of the team responsible for coordinating royal engagements with veterans organizations and military families. It's a role that would allow you to use your military experience and your obvious empathy to help bridge the connection between the Crown and those who have served, and the offer was so unexpected that James struggled to process it. Instead of ending his career in disgrace, his moment of compassion had apparently opened a door to serve the royal family in an entirely new capacity. 6 months later, James Mitchell found himself in a very different kind of uniform as he prepared for another significant royal occasion. Instead of the ceremonial red tunic and bearskin hat of the Queen's Guard, he now wore the subtle dark suit of a royal household staff member. His new role had transformed him from a silent sentinel into an active liaison between the Crown and the military families who had given so much in service to their country. The morning's event was particularly meaningful to James. King Charles III was hosting a special reception for Falklands, war veterans and their families, and James had been instrumental in organizing the guest list and ensuring that every attendee felt properly honored. Among the invited guests was Private Thomas Hartwell, whose emotional attempt to return the Queen's letter had become the catalyst for James's career transformation. As guests arrived at Buckingham Palace, James moved through the reception rooms with quiet efficiency, ensuring that each veteran felt welcomed and valued. His military background helped him connect with the attendees, while his newfound understanding of royal protocol allowed him to navigate the formal requirements of palace events. Thomas Hartwell arrived early, accompanied by his daughter who had driven him from their home in Yorkshire. The old veteran looked transformed from the desperate, weeping man James had encountered at the Queen's funeral. Today he stood straight and proud, wearing his full-dress uniform with medals polished to perfection. The weight he had carried for 4 decades had been lifted, and it showed in every aspect of his bearing. "Sergeant Mitchell," Thomas said warmly, extending his hand. "I never properly thanked you for what you did that day." James shook the veteran's hand, noting the strength that remained in the old soldier's grip. "You don't need to thank me, sir. I just helped you complete a mission that you should have been able to finish years ago." Thomas's daughter stepped forward, her eyes bright with emotion. "You have no idea what your kindness meant to our family. Dad had carried that burden for so long, wondering if he would ever be able to fulfill his promise to the Queen. What you did gave him peace." The conversation was interrupted by a subtle change in the room's atmosphere. James immediately recognized the signs of a royal arrival, even though his role had shifted from security to hospitality. King Charles III entered the reception room with the measured pace that characterized all his public appearances, but there was something particularly warm in his demeanor as he surveyed the assembled veterans. James watched with professional pride as the king began moving through the crowd, speaking personally with each veteran and their family members. This was exactly the kind of event that his new position had been created to facilitate: personal connections between the Crown and those who had served it with distinction. When the king reached Thomas Hartwell, James positioned himself discreetly nearby, ready to provide context or assistance if needed. The introduction proceeded with formal courtesy, but James could see genuine warmth in the royal interaction. "Private Hartwell," the king said, his voice carrying sincere respect. "I understand you have quite a story about my mother." Thomas straightened even further, if that was possible. "Your Majesty, she showed such kindness to my family during our darkest hour. Her letter helped us find meaning in our son's sacrifice." The king nodded thoughtfully. "I read that letter, you know. It was one of thousands she wrote over the years to families who had lost loved ones in service to the crown. But yours was special because you kept it safe for 40 years, waiting for the right moment to return it." James felt a surge of emotion as he watched the exchange. This was why he had broken protocol that September morning, to honor connections like this, where service and sacrifice created bonds that transcended ceremony and tradition. "Your Majesty," Thomas said, his voice growing stronger, "I want you to know that your mother's words weren't just comfort to us. They were a promise that our son's sacrifice mattered, that it would be remembered. Carrying that letter all these years was my way of keeping that promise alive." The king paused, clearly moved by the veteran's words. "And Sergeant Mitchell here helped you complete that promise, didn't he?" Thomas turned toward James with obvious gratitude. He risked his own career to help an old soldier finish his mission. That takes courage and compassion that goes beyond duty. The king studied James with interest. "Yes, I've heard remarkable things about Sergeant Mitchell's judgment and character. His actions that day demonstrated exactly the kind of service my mother valued most. Service that sees the person behind the uniform, the human being behind the protocol." As the reception continued, James found himself reflecting on how dramatically his life had changed. The moment of decision at the Queen's funeral had seemed like an ending, the destruction of his military career and the breaking of family tradition. Instead, it had become a beginning, opening possibilities he never could have imagined. His new role brought daily opportunities to connect veterans and military families with the royal household, ensuring that their service was recognized and their sacrifices honored. He had helped organize visits to military hospitals, coordinated support for families in crisis, and facilitated dozens of personal meetings between the king and those who had served the crown with distinction. The work was deeply fulfilling in ways that ceremonial duties had never been. Instead of standing silent and motionless, James now actively participated in the monarchy's relationship with its people. He had become a bridge between worlds, helping to ensure that the crown's connection to those who served it remained personal and meaningful. As the reception wound down, James found himself in conversation with Lady Pemberton, who had become both a mentor and a friend in his new role. She watched him interact with the veterans and their families with obvious satisfaction. "You've found your calling, haven't you?" she observed. James nodded, looking around the room at the faces of people whose service had been properly recognized and honored. "I never imagined that breaking protocol could lead to something like this, but I think this is what the Queen meant when she talked about seeing the humanity in everyone who serves." Lady Pemberton smiled. "Your grandfather and father served the crown as guards, protecting the royal family with their physical presence. You're serving it as a guardian too, but you're protecting something different, the connection between the monarchy and the people who have given everything for it." As the last guests departed, James remained in the reception room for a few quiet moments, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. The red uniform of the Queen's Guard hung in his wardrobe at home now, a symbol of proud service that had evolved into something even more meaningful. He had learned that true loyalty to the crown sometimes meant choosing compassion over protocol, humanity over rigid adherence to rules. The Queen's funeral had been a moment of ending, but for James it had also been a moment of beginning. His choice to help an elderly veteran complete his mission had transformed not just his own life, but it also helped ensure that the monarchy's most sacred duty, honoring those who serve it, continued with the personal touch that made all the difference.